Hello, I'm Sami Zaidan. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, the wealth of banks, prime ministers and parish vicars built on the backs of slaves. How much does Britain owe in reparations? Millions pulled out of poverty during the commodity boom. The pandemic could wipe out Latin America's hard-earned social and economic gains. Plus, WIRECARD and its missing billions. The German tech darling that wasn't all it was made out to be. Now, the toppling of slave owner Edward Colston's statue amid the Black Lives Matter protests has raised some uncomfortable questions about Britain's role in the slave trade. Questions like whether Britain should pay reparations for more than 200 years of free labour. The transportation of more than 1 million Africans as part of the Triangle trade helped build the British economy. The Bank of England, Lloyd's of London and some universities have acknowledged their links to the slave trade. So how much should Britain pay as a way of compensation? When Britain ended slavery, the government compensated slave traders with a share of £20 million or $21 billion in today's money. That money did not go to the slaves. British traders made £60 million, or about $10 billion, from the sale of almost 1.5 million African slaves. The value of all slave-related industries amounted to 11.1% of Britain's GDP by 1800, which would be $336 billion in 2019. Well, just a reminder, while slaves were transported to the Americas, on the route back to Britain, they took back tobacco, sugar and cotton. Just one more number for you from a US perspective. The Roosevelt Institute estimated up to $12 trillion could serve as the baseline for black reparations in the 21st century. So there's a lot to unpack here. Let's bring in Sir Hilary Beckles. He's Vice-Chancellor at the University of the West Indies and Chairman of the CARICOM Reparations Committee. Sir Hilary joins us via Skype from Bridgetown in Barbados. Good to have you with us. So it's an often discussed and debated issue. What's your take on this? Should reparations be paid?
Allow me to say this, that I am involved in this reparations discourse at the moment, but as a historian, I also know that this is probably the 7th or 8th iteration of this movement. This is a request, a movement that goes back 150 years. It emerges, it has been repressed by the British and the European governments, and it has resurfaced again at this moment in history. So this is an ongoing, continuous discourse. And as you know, these Caribbean islands were part of the most brutally exploited part of the British and European empires. And we continue to be a colonized community. You must remember that there are still colonies in the Caribbean. Europe still has colonies in the Caribbean. So this is not a liberated space. This is still a colonized space. And therefore, the conversation is about anti-colonialism. It's about decolonization. It's about the freedom of the people of this region. So yes, the people who were enslaved in this region by Britain and the European powers, back then in the middle of the 19th century, they requested compensation for the exploitation and enslavement of their labor. They demanded it then. In the early 20th century, they demanded it then. In the middle of the 20th century, they requested it again, and it is back here. So this is not something that has erupted suddenly. This is an ongoing part of the search for independence, for sovereignty. Indeed, we call the reparatory justice movement the completion of the independence process that started 50, 60 years ago.
So Hilary, though, what form should reparations take today? You mentioned the movement's in its 8th iteration, so I guess demands have evolved, right?
Yes. Effectively, the Caribbean community has said in this iteration, and this is a continuation of the 1960s requests when Some of these islands became independent when Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, Guyana, many of the larger islands became independent. And within that conversation about national independence, on the table was the request for a compensation development plan. And you remember this, when the British, for example, and the Europeans were granting independence to some of their colonies in Asia, they developed for the Asian colonies, for the East Indies colonies, they developed the Colombo Plan. They met in Colombo, what was then Sri Lanka, and they worked through a development plan for the transition of their East Indian colonies into nations, and made tremendous provisions by way of capital injections, trade preferences, investments in higher education. All of those arrangements were part of what was known as the Colombo Plan that transitioned the East Indies into nationhood and sovereignty. The West
so
Indies,
Hilary, if I could jump in, how would that differ from development aid? What kind of different kind of aid and investment that you're talking about should take place that hasn't so far?
Well, again, let me say this. When the Colombo Plan was being worked out for the East Indian colonies, the West Indian colonies made a similar request, and they were rejected. They were told that there is no obligation to these islands, despite their brutal slavery exploitation, their deep colonization, and their continuing colonization. There was also a view which was expressed very aggressively by the British government in the 1960s, that we will give you social aid. We are prepared to give you social aid to deal with issues on the social agenda, but we are not prepared to participate in an economic development plan for the West Indies. So aid was actually seen as a very negative and aggressive rejection of the call for economic development, because the governments did not share the view that they ought to participate in the economic development plan for the West Indies, still colonized, because it was not in their interest to do so. They saw the East Indian colonies as future potential markets, as places they could involve in continuing international trade. In the West Indies, it was goodbye, thank you for 300 years of slave labor, thank you for another 100 years of colonization. We no longer have a strategic interest in the West Indies, and they said this very explicitly.
Right.
So we will not invest in your economic transformation and development. And the West Indies was then one of the poorest parts of the British Empire. In fact,
right. So it's clear that you're after a wider sort of economic development commitment. What do you make of those who say, well, you know, the world has moved on, it's more than a century ago. Can you hold people to account today for the actions of their forefathers?
This is not remote at all. This is colonization in its present form. And remember, these societies were indeed calling for an economic development plan that they were entitled to. The British Prime Minister Lloyd George in 1926 made the statement that the Caribbean is the slum of the British Empire. It's an embarrassment to the British Empire because of its poverty. When the West Indian governments asked for an economic development plan, they were rejected. The Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Dr. Eric Williams, made that famous statement in 1962, just before his country became independent. He said, Britain see the Caribbean as an orange. They have sucked it dry, thrown the peel onto the ground, and now they are afraid to slip on that peel. It was not a long time ago. It is very much in the present. And because they demanded economic compensation, they demanded the right to reparatory justice. But because Britain and the European powers were able to use their authority so bluntly and so brutally, these islands were not able to allow their voice to go to the international community. It is only now that most of them are secure in their sovereignty that they are able to raise their voices once again and say this conversation must continue.
Millions of people in Latin America were lifted out of poverty during the commodity boom more than a decade ago. But there are concerns now the pandemic could undo those hard-won gains. That would leave economies with unmanageable debt. For years, Chile has been hailed as Latin America's most successful free market economy. But the pandemic is exposing the country's inequalities. Despite a nationwide curfew and lockdowns, many Chileans say the government's response to the economic fallout has been too little too late. Our Latin America editor, Lucia Newman, reports from Santiago.
Macarena Vinet takes us on a tour of La Victoria, a low-income neighborhood on the outskirts of Santiago. Its murals, dating back to the 1980s, tell the story of its residents' political struggle against Chile's former military dictatorship.
This is the mural in honor of the people who were detained and disappeared.
It was a time when the community got together to create soup kitchens to confront a profound economic crisis. When soldiers rushed in to arrest or kill protesters under an endless state of emergency. 40 years later, for many, it feels like déjà vu. Again, there's a curfew, a state of emergency with soldiers on the streets and police fighting protesters. And once again, the women of this community are cooking for the hungry in soup kitchens. This pandemic has exposed the deep fault lines of Chile's economic system. There are millions of people now out of work, and much of the so-called middle class has been plunged into poverty, which is why tens of thousands of people are now resorting to this in order to have something to eat. But there's a difference between now and when Edna Sepulveda's mother used to serve spaghetti with beans.
In the 80s, we were all either poor or rich. The majority were poor, of course, but then things changed. We thought we'd become middle class, but it wasn't true because we're all in debt with credit cards and loans. Now we're all unemployed and we can't pay our debts and bills. We're poor again.
Under its neoliberal economic model, Chile has become the Latin American country with the highest per capita income, but with a catch.
On paper, our GDP is similar to Portugal's, except only 9% of Chileans receive the average income, while in Portugal it's 53% of the population. In Portugal, the middle class is middle class, while here most average income earners are more like poor Portuguese and extremely fragile economically.
Chile's conservative government is now offering an economic aid package to the middle class. The problem is that millions of people, including many of those in line at the soup kitchen, no longer qualify even as lower middle class. All this is adding fuel to the still unresolved political, social, and economic explosion that erupted in Chile last October, and which the pandemic had put on pause, at least for a while. Lucia Newman, Al Jazeera, Santiago.
I'm delighted now to say Jairo Lugo Ocando joins us to discuss the challenges facing the region. Jairo is the resident professor at Northwestern University in Qatar and Latin America analyst. Good to have you with us. So, Jairo, at one point we were talking about how over 70 million people were lifted out of poverty in a decade. Are all of those gains about to be undone by the pandemic?
I'm sorry to say yes, a lot of it is going to be done. But I think it reflects a wider problem.
That's terrible, Jairo. Is there no way out of this? I mean, we like happy endings in life, don't we?
Yes, but not always there are happy endings in life. And this is not a movie, but reality. And one of the problems that we face in Latin America is that many of the governments that managed to lift a lot of people out of poverty because of their redistributive policies, nevertheless, did not make structural changes to the economy. So the Latin American economies are still heavily dependent on commodities, on primary products, and once the global crisis has taken off, it's just revealed what's an underlying problem, which is the Latin American economies fail to modernize and to adapt to a more globalized world.
In addition to restructuring, we've got the issue of debt, though, and there is some debt rescheduling going on, right? Is that going to be enough to avoid the economies being compounded and dragged down even further?
Well, the Latin American debt, it's been the biggest dormant problem, and we all remember the 1980s Mexican crisis that led to the region to the so-called lost decade of the 1990s. And we are truly in the face of repeating that situation. I mean, the debts in Latin American countries, if anything, has got bigger, although a little bit more diversified. So it's less of a risk to the traditional banks that was. You know, if you remember the late 1980s, one of the big problems for the international financial system was that a lot of the eggs had been put in one single basket. Now it's far more diversified. But for Latin America itself, it continues to be a big problem. I mean, the debt, for example, Venezuela, my own country, has skyrocketed from something like $34 billion in 1998 to over $217 billion nowadays. So it is a big problem in the whole of Latin America. And of course, what the region faces is a downturn of its main products. You know, agriculture, the CEPAL, the Latin American Committee for Economic Analysis, CEPAL, estimate that there's going to be like a fall of 6% in agriculture and some 6% also in minerals. Oil, which affects dearly Venezuela, Colombia, but also places like Ecuador, in Mexico, is going to be down 40%. And that's a huge, huge impact. But even within the region itself, what the region trades among each country, like energy, that's going to be down around 20%. So we're facing the perfect storm in the region.
So overall, what kind of economic contraction is Latin America looking at? 7%, I think, is what the IMF is talking about. Worse?
Yeah, well, depending where you look, but for example, the CEPAL estimate that that contraction could be between 7 to 9%, but we don't know. You know, a lot of the economy it has to do with expectations, and a lot of the governments nowadays in Latin America are not governments in pro of expansionist policy, like, you know, investment in the economy, but on the contrary, are more prone to adopt austerity policies. And that means that the expectations, if those expectations go down, then consumption will go down, and the region will probably face, rather than 7 up to 9% of downturn.
Well, that segues nicely into my next point, particularly about austerity measures. Do you think Brazil will go ahead with those austerity measures that the president has been promising?
Well, politically it's going to be very difficult, but he has to do it. You know, just no money in the public finances, and that's not only the case of Brazil. I mean, we see a government like the Argentina under Fernandez, who came to power promising the end of the MARKUS austerity program, and has only have to deepen the program instead. And so it's not, you know, it's not a choice in many cases. Now, I'm not a believer that the austerity programs had actually worked in many cases. In most cases, have actually made matters worse. But the problem is there's no money. So the government has the simple decision between doing austerity or basically printing more money and injecting it to the economy. But at the end of the day, who's going to pay for that? And also the impact upon inflation. Do remember that Brazil a very bad memory of hyperinflation in Brazil during the era of the initial stages of democracy in Brazil. And that's something that Brazilians do not want to go. You know, it's a little bit like Germany. They're very inflation phobic. And they have that strong collective memory against inflation. So I do think that Bolsonaro will implement some sort of austerity program, but I don't think it's going to be as harsh as people are expecting, because he will have to negotiate even within his own party about the political implications of trying to deepen. And that's one of the problems that of trying to implement a structural adjustment program nowadays in Latin America.
All right, it's been great getting your thoughts. Thanks so much, Jairo.
Thank you.
Now, it's being dubbed the Enron of Germany. WIRECARD was the country's fintech darling, but its collapse and arrest of its chief executive after billions of dollars went missing has raised some uncomfortable questions about corporate regulation. The regulator got it so badly wrong it filed a criminal complaint against the journalists from the Financial Times who broke the story. Al Jazeera's Dominic Kane has more from Berlin.
Until recently, this man's company WIRECARD was worth tens of billions of dollars and apparently a lucrative investment option. Now the firm is insolvent and Markus BRAUN and several of his former colleagues are in custody on suspicion of manipulating accounts.
The suspects and further accomplices agreed from 2015 were to inflate WIRECARD's balance sheet and sales volume through fake income, and they were reported through business with so-called third-party acquirers.
WIRECARD's core business was online payment processing. Over the course of several years, it expanded its business around the world, but it was its activities in Asia which raised suspicion. Journalists like Dan McCrum of the Financial Times discovered that billions of dollars in cash the company claimed to have just could not be found.
The business didn't really seem to exist. And then we started looking at these accounts, what the company had said, and these various business deals which it had done in Singapore and other places in Asia. And really, what we found just didn't add up. So we started publishing pieces which raised questions about these things, and that led more people to get in touch and us to raise more questions about the company's accounts.
So persistent was McCrum's questioning that he believes WIRECARD set up private surveillance of him and his colleagues because he believes they feared the damage McCrum's articles were causing to their brand.
People have made a lot of money investing in WIRECARD, and that breeds a sense that you are right, you've made the correct decision to invest in it. And WIRECARD was very successful at demonizing its critics. It waged a substantial campaign to undermine the reputation of the Financial Times. And for a long time, it wasn't successful, but it succeeded in putting doubt in people's minds. And so I think that is a large part of this as well. It was WIRECARD very effectively demonized its critics and was able to get out of answering legitimate questions about its business model.
When WIRECARD filed for insolvency a few weeks ago, its share price plummeted and many of its shareholders found themselves facing serious losses. Wolfgang Schiarp is a Berlin-based lawyer representing thousands of them.
It starts with Grandma Müller, who has invested some of her pension fund money in WIRECARD, maybe just 2,000 euros, and has lost everything. And it goes up to huge private persons and also institutional investors who may hold two-digit million euro figures or even hundreds of millions of euros. It's a very wide range of people who burned their hands in this case.
The man accused of masterminding the alleged fraud denies any wrongdoing.
It can't be ruled out that WIRECARD has become the aggrieved party in a case of fraud of considerable proportions.
On a wider scale, the scandal has highlighted the role of the regulators in Germany. Wolfgang Schiarp is highly critical.
I think they have failed totally. It's not easy to hold them responsible, though, because the German lawmaker has introduced a legal privilege into our written laws in Germany. Paragraph 4, Section 4 of the law regulating BaFin says that they shall not be held accountable under state liability terms. So you have to overcome this legal obstacle.
And then there is the behaviour of successive governments going back much of the past decade, with current Finance Minister Olaf Scholz in particular facing tough questions over what he knew about the scandal and when. Back at the end of June, Mr. Scholz was clear that wide-scale reform of the financial sector is needed.
A scandal like the one at WIRECARD must be a wake-up call, that we need more oversight and control of the finance markets than we have today. We owe that to shareholders, employees of these firms, and in particular Germany as a financial centre, and all of us as citizens.
The official response here at the Finance Ministry is a three-point action plan. Firstly, to strengthen the financial regulator BaFin to give it the sovereign power to intervene in public companies. Secondly, to beef up the auditors regulator APAS to allow it to impose sanctions on rule breakers. And finally, to oblige all companies to change their auditors every 10 years. But right now, there remain many unanswered questions about what really happened with WIRECARD and why it took so long for the authorities to notice. Dominic Kane, Al Jazeera, Berlin.
And that's our show for this week. But remember, you can get in touch with us via Twitter. Use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. There's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Sami Zaidan. From the whole team here, thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.